For Polity in Johannesburg, I'm Darlene Creamer. South African politician and author Yunus Carrim joins me to discuss his remarkable book, Attacking the Heart of Apartheid, the ANC's MK Special Operation Unit. His compelling book draws on 103 interviews with 48 people, amounting to over 162 hours of recorded conversations conducted between March 2016 and December 2024. Among the many positive reviews, former President Kgalema Motlanthe has praised the book for its ambitious and important account of South Africa's history. He commended the way it brings to light the emotional and ethical dimensions of the African National Congress's military wing, Umkhonto Sizwe, known as MK, and the liberation struggle in a way that hasn't been done in the 3 decades since the advent of democracy in South Africa. Mr. Carrim, could you share some insights into this interview process and tell us more about the people you spoke to?
Well, firstly, in general, I should say, with all their frailties and warts, like all of us human beings, overall, they were a remarkable group of people. The overriding sense you get from the interviewees is their commitment to overthrowing apartheid. And in a way, it's very sad that the ANC and country has become what it has. Rashid, that's his MK name, Abu Bakr Ismail, he's the longest serving commander of MK Special Ops and the only one still alive. He gave me a list of names of the operatives that served in Special Ops. But of course, he didn't have most of their contact details. Finding the details of people, especially in the context where their real names were not even known to the commander or indeed the people in the unit they served in. And many of them had several MK names. So I tried the Department of Military Veterans. They could help, but obviously they didn't have MK names. The way it worked was once I traced them, I approached them and said, look, I'm doing this work. Would you be interested in cooperating? And what I found was that people were very enthusiastic about being interviewed. I must say about 4 of them got very emotional, 2 of them actually tearing, because absolutely nobody has bothered in the 35 years since we've been unbanned to ask them, what is it you did in Special Ops? Rashid, in fact, had been asked by Joe Slovo in the year in which Slovo passed away to write up the history of Special Ops because Slovo wasn't in a condition to do it. So finally, he said, why don't you just do it and he will cooperate? And I must say, without his contribution to this book, it would have been less useful. The other person that stood out in cooperating on this book is Ernest Pule. He went out of his way to trace people, and he was immensely helpful on this project. The way it worked was I would do a recorded interview. Once I got the transcription back, I went through it and checked them against the actual recording. So it was an immensely time-consuming process, but it made for greater accuracy. And all of this will be, over the next 3 months, interviews and other material put on the websites of the Nelson Mandela Foundation and the South African History Online.
The ANC's armed struggle intensified dramatically with the strategic bombing of Sasol 1, Natref, and Sasol 2 during the night of 31 May to the 1st of June in 1980. The blasts at Sasol 1 were reportedly heard several kilometers away, and the impact was so intense that residents in nearby Zandela were shaken out of their beds. Could you elaborate on the planning for and significance of this operation?
So firstly, the role of Special Ops was not to carry out ordinary routine MK operations. It had a specific mandate, which was to hit high impact, high visibility, strategic, economic, and military targets. And part of hitting the economic targets included the fuel and energy side. The aim was to undermine the economy, dent the morale of white people and others who supported apartheid, bolster the confidence and morale of the masses, and convey that MK is not some ragtag army. It's not committed to small little operations. It is really something that the state should take seriously. So When Sasol was attacked, it was deliberately chosen because of its contribution to the fuel needs of South Africa. We were getting increasingly isolated because of apartheid. South Africa needed crude oil reserves. And in a major technological leap, South African scientists, the first ever group to do this, found a way of using coal to get oil. And so there was an oil embargo, and the ANC said, let's target Sasol. And it was the first ever operation of special ops, and generally regarded as the best of all the MK operations for the reasons you said and many others. If you look at that operation, you had 3 teams of special ops people coming into the country. And Sasol 1 and Sasol 2, major tanks were aflame. It stunned the regime. Many refused to believe the ANC is capable of such an operation. People were very excited. It was the first powerful explosion of that sort. It made world news. And it also boosted the morale of people who were in international anti-apartheid movement that, look, something's happening. The heading of that chapter is like a volcano gone mad. The flames only went out, I think, 3 or 4 days later. There were 400 firefighters at one stage fighting the largest fire South Africa ever experienced. Now, I'm not going to glorify all that, Dali. The important thing is nobody died. The important thing was the ANC's overall approach was not to cause the death of civilians. In later years, as the struggle intensified and the state was more repressive than ever, after the Cowboy Conference, they said MK unit should go ahead and hit military and other targets. And if it meant that civilians died, that's collateral damage in a war situation. And they said, we are definitely against targeting civilians. There's no doubt that the Sasol operation shook the state, it shook business, and various pieces of legislation were passed to suppress information about guerrilla attacks, and the National Key Points Act was passed to make it a national security protection area.
Please, can you tell us more about Operation Blackout? The apartheid regime's electricity infrastructure was a major vulnerability. How was this exploited by MK?
That's also another outstanding operation. Camden, Arnott, and Delmas power stations were all attacked in what was then the Eastern Transvaal. Again, there were no deaths. But what the ANC intended to convey was you are vulnerable as a state. You are vulnerable as citizens who are supporting apartheid. Don't you think it's time you nudged your government, National Party government, to talk to the ANC? It was really a remarkable feat that within the space of a few hours, 3 power stations were attacked. Now, of course, this was part of Operation Blackout 1. The ANC had intended to constantly target the energy sector, the electricity sector, and there was a plan to have an overall longer-term Operation Blackout. Now, obviously, blackouts mean something very different today. And the very people that took part in that operation on behalf of Special Ops would themselves get extremely upset every time there's Eskom's load shedding or municipal load shedding. But you have to understand, Darlene, that that was a very different context. A very large percentage of Africans had no electricity. And it's wrong. Why should whites, and to a large extent Indians and so-called coloureds, get electricity and not Africans? And that was a key sector of the economy. If you have no electricity, how do you function? So it is part of that strategy. What is remarkable about these people who played that role is they all got across the border again and escaped any arrest. And again, it's quite hilarious because Johannes Mnisi, he was known as Victor Molefe at the time, said to Esther Ward, a Sunday Independent journalist, that, you see, he had a false pass and he drives, you see. So other cadres jumped over the fence, but he had to take the car back. So on his way, he stopped at a roadblock. And the guy says to him in Afrikaans something like, you know, you should be very careful. There are terrorists around here. So he said, I'm very unhappy. And meanwhile, he's the main terrorist, so to speak. So when he gets to the border, the immigration guy says to him, what happened last night? So Misi says to him, you see, there's too many terrorists here. I am not coming back to your country again because it's a Swazi passport, I think. And the guy said, no. Presumably it's a white guy. He says, no, things will be fine. You must come back. And so he just waved to him and went on.
In August 1981, 5 rockets struck Voortrekkerhoogte, the South African Defence Force's main base in Pretoria. This mission involved MK Commander Joe Slovo recruiting a British couple pretending to be married, who rented a farm to create a base for the attack. Could you give us more detail about this operation?
Yeah, you see, consistent with special ops mandates, they had hit a fuel target, then an electricity target. Now they had to hit the military. And Joe Slovo recruited, through the British Communist Party in London, Nicholas Heath and Bonnie Muller. They came to South Africa and they hired a farm, which was about 600 meters away from a police station. And they told the owner that they were a British couple. Nicholas was not well, and she brought him to South Africa, Bonnie did, so that he could recover. They paid, I think, 6 months' rent in advance. They were not married, actually. They weren't a couple even. Their aim was to assist this attack on Voortrekkerhoogte. You can't have black people, African people in particular, renting a small holding there with a typically conservative white owner. So they set up the base, and in the meanwhile, Rashid and others, Guido van Hecken and so on, decided to put a Grad P, which is a very big grenade launcher, under a F-250 van. Now, to get it under a van was extremely difficult. And after endless efforts and working with a guy called Carrim, a Mozambican panel beater, they got it done. It was the first time a Grad P rocket launcher would be used, and the weight of it was a big challenge. And of course, despite all their planning, when Nicholas Heath and Bonnie Muller got to the border post, to the South African side from Swaziland, they suddenly found that the car came to a halt with ignition issues. And so they got very nervous and distraught and were very vulnerable. But they decided nevertheless to soldier ahead, and so they began pushing the van. So the security officers there with their dog came to their aid and pushed the van, and much to the relief of Heath and Muller, the van got going again. And they waved a friendly goodbye. They weren't searched. The dogs were not put on them, on the van at least. And little did the immigration officials and police know that they were actually aiding a guerrilla attack on the main military base of the South African army. And Rashid says laughingly, he says, of all the things, after all our planning, how are you meant to anticipate that the ignition of the van would not work? But when they got back to Joburg and brought the van in to Mooiplaas, as it was called, that small holding, Heath and Muller waited for Bani Morekwane, the operational commander of this particular attack on the army. And once he came in, they left and went back to England. Now, Bani and the others who joined him shortly after that were presenting themselves as laborers. And then they prepared to hit the SADF. I think it was just after 10 p.m. on the 12th of August. They fired 5 of the rockets. And the first rocket came with such a huge roar that people in Rasmea, I think it is, and Lodium came out to see what was going on. They thought the South African Defence Force drill. Nobody who was observing thought it's MK, MK Special Operations Unit or MK. They wouldn't have thought that the ANC was capable of such a sophisticated operation, right? So one of the cadres was a guy called Philemon. And what got him worried was there were some young people leaning on the front bonnet of his car and watching on. And he said to Esther, wow, the journalist, it was like being at FNB Stadium. So many people came out. Now he got anxious because he wasn't part of the operatives. He was assisting one of the operatives whose friend he was. And Philemon now got very anxious. And he was worried that somebody might remember later when they discover it wasn't an SADF exercise. They might trace his number and describe his band, so he disappears. And when the cadres are ready to go back to the farm, they find he's not there. So finally, they made their way back, but the security apparatus had put up roadblocks everywhere and began a major hunt looking for these culprits, as it were. And astonishingly, they came right to the front gate of the farm, Moiklas. And what Bolekmani and them done was they thought, look, they've had it. So before the army surfaced there, they had already planned to fight to the death. They were not going to give in. So they reorganized the entire house. They put the mattresses elsewhere. They had sorted the windows out. They positioned themselves on duty to fight back. If you know Bani Molekwane, as I've come to through others, he's a remarkably brave guy. I think he's a legend in MK circles. He died together with two others, Vincent Siketi and Victor Kariana, on the 28th of November, 1985, in another attempt on Sasol. So he and his comrades were prepared to die. But as I said, they came right to the gate and they said, no, there's nobody on this farm. And they retreated. The comrades could hear the murmur of voices, the dogs barking, but amazingly, nothing happened. The security never entered the farm. Then some while later, when the roadblocks began to ease, they made their way back to Maputo. Now, the rockets themselves didn't hit the targets they had hoped, but they had reached the army. Just that you had the daring to attack the army, that in itself was a huge psychological morale booster.
Your book is filled of gripping and surprising stories. One particularly compelling account involves Patrick Chamuso and his work with MK Special Operations. Could you speak about his contributions and also about Rodney Wilkinson, the national fencing champion who became an unlikely saboteur as he, along with others, planted explosives at the Koeberg nuclear power station in 1982?
Yeah, Patrick Chamuso is my favorite chapter. I think it's called Wrong Place, Wrong Time, Wrong Person. Here's a guy with no formal education who is not interested in politics, who's even wary of the African National Congress, whose main interests, as he says, are painting people's houses and football. And he keeps getting arrested for ANC activities that he knew nothing about and was not connected to in any remote way even. He's a very enterprising person, and he observed that when it came to the townships and you had weddings or birthdays, or wedding anniversaries or other occasions, it's mostly the photographer, Indian photographer from the city center, who would come and take the photographs. And he thought, why can't I do that? Because I know the community, I speak the language. So that's how he gets to become a photographer. So he became very successful, working both as a painter and a photographer. And he was able at some stage to accumulate about 8,000 rands. So he goes to buy a new Peugeot. And when he gets to the place where they're selling it, there are these Afrikaners who are the salespeople for new cars. When he went there and said he wants this new Peugeot, they jeered at him. And they say, how? And they use the K word. How? K. We can't afford this car. How are you going to afford it? What do you do? So he said, he's a painter. They said, how can a painter afford this? He says, no, boss. I've got the money. They said, no, bring your money if you've got it. So he goes to Witbank, he collects the money, he remembers that it was put in cardboard boxes, and he brings the 7,200 rand, which I think is what the cost of the car was, and they look surprised. And they say, no, why don't you go and sit down and have some coffee? So he's taken into a little room where obviously the people who wash the cars, the African workers who wash the cars every day, they drink their tea and coffee or whatever it is. And they gave him a big mug of coffee and they gave him a piece of bread and they said, just sit here, we'll consider you. Then comes 3 policemen and they take him away. And he said, what for? I've done nothing wrong. No, they take him to the police station. They start hitting him and saying, where did you get this money from? While that commotion was taking place in the police offices there, the superintendent or whatever opened the door and said, what's all this noise about? And then he looks at Patrick. He says, hey, is that you, Patrick? Patrick's bleeding. He says, yeah, boss. And he says, but I know this man. He painted my house. He painted my daughter's house. Let me speak to him. I know him. So he takes him away in handcuffs to his own office and says, now, Patrick, tell me the truth. Where did you steal this money from? He says, no, boss, I didn't steal it. I earned it. Finally, the superintendent says, okay, let's go to your bank. They go to the bank, and the lady there showed the weekly amount he was depositing. She says, yes, that's his money. So the superintendent apologized. He said, come, let's go and get your car. And he said, no, I don't want to go there. Father Dominic took him to another place. He got his new Peugeot. That was in 1973. In 1976, he and his partner, Agnes Lungwe, were coming back from her brother's wedding. And they were in Diepverdien and close to the border with Botswana. It was the route, Patrick said, that the people crossing into Botswana to join MK and other liberation movement structures, that was the route they were taking. So he gets stopped at a roadblock. They ask him, how you can afford this new car and nice clothes? He says, no, boss, I do a lot of work and I'm painting and all. But they opened the boot and saw the reels of film. They said, you said you're a painter. So what are you doing? He says, no, I was taking photographs of my girlfriend's brother's wedding. And they said, no, we know what you're doing. You're taking photographs of these young boys that are crossing over the border to go join the ANC. And you're taking photographs so that you then send it to Lusaka or wherever, and they can check that the people you facilitated the crossing of are the same people that are turning up at the doors of ANC. And he said, no, he wouldn't listen to him. So they assaulted him and they kept him in detention and finally they released him. But they realized his father was Mozambican origin, so they deported him. But being as enterprising as he is, he's on the train and he notices that the policemen who are meant to take responsibility for him and other deportees to Mozambique are distracted. One of them is a bit tipsy, another is distracted by some woman. And so what he does is when the train is slowing down, he jumps off. And he's furious that he can't get his Dompas back. And he can't get his car back. In fact, he tried after 1990 to get his car back. Sure, nobody responded. But anyway, he then decides to join the ANC. Now, he has no real knowledge of the ANC. And he ends up in a flat. So when he sees this white guy, he says he's got big glasses. Big guy. I'm not going to talk to him. Finally, he opens up and he tells Slovo, look, all I want to do is go back and take revenge on the whites because they detained me and they took my car and my wife doesn't want to have anything to do with me because she's a terrorist, etc. So Slovo tells him, no, we're not against whites. We're not against the people. We're against the system of apartheid. So he then sends Chamuso to go and meet somebody else. So a further culture shock. The person who's meant to initially assist him with understanding ANC policy and politics is of Indian descent. It's Rashid Abubakar Ismail, his real name. Then he's sent to the camps for quick training. Then he comes back. He enters the country. He hits Sasol. The attack was nowhere as successful, regrettably, as was originally planned. He also hit TransAlloys, which is a power station. But he had one understandable vulnerability. He wanted to take his daughter back to Mozambique. So he heads towards, I think it's Zambela, one of the townships. And there's a roadblock. He's in a Datsun. He's driving at high speed and he realizes he's in trouble. So he swings around and the police immediately get suspicious. They trail him and they shoot at his Datsun. The car topples over and he gets out of the car and escapes into a bush nearby. And the dogs are following. So he crosses the river and he disappears. I think he walked about 80 kilometers seeking his other partner's hut. But the police had found out about that, so they wait for him there. And I think 2 or 3 days later, as he gets there they are waiting for him. So they arrest him. And he got a 24-year sentence. He ended up on Robben Island. His story is fascinating also, because when he got released after 1990, He went to see Slovo. Slovo offered him a job in national intelligence, and he said no, he wants to do his own thing. So he set up an orphanage for HIV and AIDS children. And he said he's not interested in this me-meism. He's very critical of what has happened to many of his comrades post-1994. Now, Rodney Wilkinson and another great partner carried out a remarkable operation in Coburg. Before Coburg was ready to produce electricity, he got a job there, and Heather, his partner at the time, also assisted. But he carried out that operation. He was trained to manage the operation by Rashid, and he had initial contact with Maharaj, and it was remarkable. It happened around the 17th and 18th of December 1982. 4 limpet mines spread over 18 hours, exploded. The government refused to accept the ANC was capable of such a slick and professional operation. One of the senior leaders of ESCOM said that no, this operation was done by the West German anarchist guerrilla movement Baader Meinhof. Others said it was done within ESCOM and the state by the French company that was building the plant, because the delays would mean they'd get paid more than they otherwise would in terms of the contract. Nobody wanted to believe that the ANC was capable of it. Rodney was not seen as a likely saboteur. He was somebody who was part of the hippie culture of the late 60s and 70s. Although he was progressive, he was not seen as the type who would enter the ANC. In our movement, we drew people from every sphere of life who were driven mostly by their contempt for apartheid. They discussed what was going on. When he was finished with the operation, he left the country and later ended up in London. And he's got a very fertile, creative mind. So he kept saying to Slovo when he came to London and to others there who were linked to the ANC that, look, we need to get more arms into the country. And he came up with this idea that, look, there are a lot of people who go to South Africa on safari, and they enter the country through safari trucks. Why don't we get a big truck, he said, and underneath set up what we call a dead letter box, a compartment where you could put AK-47s, grenades, limpet mines, and so on. It's quite a sophisticated operation. So the secret safari was substantially Rodney Wilkinson's idea.
The book also underscores the critical role women played in the liberation struggle. One particularly powerful quote is by Greta Appelgren, who says, "I suppose being a township girl, I had a high threshold for physical pain. I was never going to confess. I said to them, I want to hang by my neck. I knew I was going to die, but I was not going to confess privately to some judge. All the time they were torturing me, I was praying. While they were screaming and I was being strangled, I was praying. That made it possible for me not to feel the pain. You're not physically there when you're praying so hard." Those words are deeply moving and brave. Could you elaborate on the role women played in the struggle, especially figures like Greta Appelgren, Marion Sprague, Helene Pasteurs, and Heather Gray?
Women played a very significant role in various MK units and machineries, but in special ops they played a particularly significant role, particularly white women whom you would not expect to be guerrillas, and internationalists with their foreign passports. Let's start with Greta. She was driven, I think, by what she learned in her family. She's a so-called colored, right? She came from a socially responsible, very religious family. She herself is a devout Catholic. And the Catholic Church, especially in eThekwini, but I can't speak for others, played a very prominent role, Archbishop Dennis Hurley and others, in making people aware of the wrongs of apartheid and in contributing to the upliftment of people of color. And she was very influenced by the Catholic Church. She's very morally driven. And she remains active in, for example, the Veterans League of the ANC, the military war veterans of MK, and civil society structures. She's a very modest person. And if you think about Greta, that she would become a guerrilla, she's a social worker, okay, is a reflection of how abhorrent apartheid was. And so it drew people from every sphere of society against it, of every race and color. If you look then at the other people you've mentioned, Marion Sprague is a remarkable person too. She went to the ANC, got training, and then they wanted to make use of her because she's a journalist in Voice of the ANC and so on, Voice of Women, the ANC Women's League publication, but she wanted to fight. So she persuaded them that they send her back in the country, and they decided, let's put her in special ops because she's white, she can do things that others can't, and a woman in particular. So she carries out 3 operations. John Foster Square, please, was a dreaded security police station, right? And the ANC wanted to hit it because many people died there and were tortured very severely. But they couldn't get in. But what she does is she goes to the police station. She says she's looking for a license for a gun. They let her in. She reconnoiters the place. She comes out. A day or two later, she decides to go back. But this time, interestingly, unlike the last time when they didn't search her, this time there's a black policeman there. And he stops her and says, "Madam, I have to search your bag." And she protests. This non-racialist, this gorilla of the ANC says, no, you can't search my bag, implying that you don't search a madam's bag, right? And the white policeman at the front there peers over his newspaper. Then she says to him, he wants to search my bag, like a typical white racist would, right, I suppose. Though it was so tactically sound for her. So the white policeman, no, you can't search your bag, let her go. So in a strange way, it was a white policeman that facilitated the bomb explosion at John Foster Square. She also was asked to attack Cambridge in East London police station, and she hit Hillbrow the same day after she attacked John Foster. There are some hilarious stories in her case. Then you ask about Helene. She is a Belgian citizen. She doesn't see herself as an internationalist. She says she's a cosmopolitan. She brought the car bomb in for the South African Air Force operation. She also did a lot of reconnaissance inside the country together with her then partner, Klaas de Jonge. She was based in Maputo as a lecturer at Edward Mondlane University. And she also was based inside South Africa. But unfortunately, she got arrested. After 4 years in prison, she was released following negotiations between the Belgian and South African governments. Her passion and her commitment to this continent and to progressive causes the world over continues till this day. And she was given a national order by the president for contribution to the struggle. Heather Gray worked very closely with Rodney Wilkinson, and she didn't literally carry out the operation, but she was there. As she said, she was his comrade soulmate. Because Rodney is seen as having a somewhat nervous disposition, she was there to assist, to stabilize things, but he bounced a lot of the ideas on how to carry out the operation. Following meetings with Rashid, he would bounce things off her to get her ideas. And she played a major role. She's not sufficiently acknowledged. And she is yet another remarkable woman.
The royalties from this book will go to families of those in special ops who lost their lives in the struggle. What inspired you to do that?
You see, if you look at my work life and political life, for 30 years I was in Parliament. And I've ended up with a rather handsome pension. Even as a professor of sociology, I wouldn't have got this pension. 10 years before that, I was in the University of Natal, as it was known on the campus. So 40 years, I've been working in the public sector. So it's your taxes that have paid me. I don't feel correct to get any money out of this. Now, regrettably, the ANC, the government, we, all of us, I feel, have not given MK members their dues. They get these special pensions that are limited in value. Many of them don't have a formal education. Those of us who participated in the struggle in sections outside the political underground, and especially MK, we played our role, but we were earning. And I just feel that I think it should be allocated to one or more of the families, depending on how much is secured in terms of royalties, of those special ops operatives who died in the struggle. That's not my decision. It will be made by, hopefully, Rashid and Pule and them. They must decide.
That was Yunus Carrim discussing his book, Attacking the Heart of Apartheid.